Hey everybody, Brian Hunt here with you again. In this video, I'm going to do a review and a tutorial on how to use the Freefly WAVE camera. So first off, I did not buy this camera. I rented this camera from Ontario Camera Rentals. They're located in Toronto, Canada. I'm sure there's different locations in the US or in other parts of Canada for rentals for this WAVE Freefly camera. But the reasons that we rented this camera, it was for a gig. It was for 4 days of shooting. I've had it for a little bit longer to play with it a bit and do some camera tests and do some setup. The reason we went with the Freefly WAVE camera was a couple of reasons. First would be, and the main thing would be budget. Okay, so everybody's heard of the Phantom cameras, the Phantom Flex. Those cameras, they shoot amazing stuff. They look gorgeous. They do 1,000 frames per second plus 4K. You know, they're gorgeous. They do these things that are amazing. They're also very expensive, and they're expensive to rent even. So a rental on one of those cameras is about $2,800, $3,000 per day. And there's some other issues you're going to get into with that camera when you're shooting at those super high frame rates that I will get into a little bit later in this video. But one of those big issues is light. You need a lot of light. The more you keep going up in your frame rates, the more light you need. And it escalates very quickly, especially when you are getting up into with this camera shooting at 422 frames per second is their top at its kind of 4K resolution. When you start getting to the 1,000 frames per second, then you need a ton of light. So that can be another issue as well, because you don't just need to rent the camera and other things. You need to rent some big lights unless you have some crazy lighting. And I have a pretty good lighting package and very bright kind of lighting package. And I still was struggling in the studio with this on some different areas where I wanted more and more light. And you might be able to hear a little bit of a hum right now. It's on. The camera is actually on. So there's a bit of a hum. It kind of has a noise to it. Not terrible, but you would never use this camera for recording dialogue or for recording just regular video. I don't think there's any real use for it, even though you can shoot regular frames per second. But there's no audio inputs on this. There's no other kind of inputs on this. It's really a very simple camera. It's basically a brain. It's basically a brain in a cage, or not a cage, sorry, just a brain in a case in a camera with a sensor. I'll show you guys on the menu here some of the simple things you can do. It's very, very simple. You know, you have a record button, you have a on-off button, you have a button to toggle through your menu. So I can go through here, I can do a playback of stuff. I can go back and I can change my resolution. I can also just go over and change my frame rate. It goes to my max frame rate, depending on what my resolution is. I can change my shutter angle. So shutter angle on this, you know, default on it is 180-degree shutter, which is a very standard thing. But if you wanted to have a sharper shutter, you can change that and go down and have a little bit of a sharper shutter. Again, you're going to lose more light if you're doing this. And then the next one is your white balance. And then there's some color profile settings here. Now, I'll go into the color and the kind of dynamic range of this camera, some of the limitations of this camera right off the bat. This has been talked about a lot in other videos and on forums and stuff for this camera. It doesn't have the best dynamic range. It's not a crazy dynamic range. I mean, my A1 I'm shooting on right now, my A7S III, my FX6, my FX9, they have way better dynamic range that I've found than this camera. So there is challenges that way. If you're in a studio and you're shooting some stuff that way, and there's some stuff I shot, you can make it look beautiful. I think it actually looks really great on skin tones. There is problems when you get into these extreme things, which extreme highlights and extreme contrast within scenes. And I was outside shooting a lot of things like this, a lot of stuff where it becomes very extreme. When I'm on a ski hill and you have the white snow, you have the no clouds or a few clouds in the sky, and you have the sun beating down on it and reflecting off that snow. And you want to maybe protect your highlights for the snow, but then you're way too dark for the people that you're shooting. And so on a camera with a higher dynamic range, you're able to keep a lot more details in that white, in that highlights area. This camera I've found definitely challenges with that. But with that said, you could still get some great images. And for getting a camera that can shoot 422 frames per second. So going back what I said before, the reason for using this, I mean, this camera for cost wise, the rental in this camera was, I think it's around $500 per day. So, and the cost of this camera, I think, is $10,000 Canadian or 10,000 US. So it's not ridiculous, but it is definitely a specialty camera. There's not really, in my opinion, any other uses to use this camera than as a kind of slow-mo camera and being able to place it on things like a gimbal and having a small slow-mo camera or on a drone. So going back into the menu, you can bring this back to default settings. You can change the time. You can format your card. In this camera, you have a 2 terabyte hard drive. I think maybe they sell different ones with different sizing of hard drives or external SSDs. This one I rented here has a 2 terabyte one, and I had no problems with that. I could roll with it pretty much all day. You know, you're doing selected clips, but I never got close to using that whole 2 terabytes. I got, maybe down to where I had like 500 gigs left. So using a terabyte and a half. So it's another thing to think about as well with these cameras is when you're finished shooting for a day, you're going to have a lot of offload of storage that you need to back up. So then another thing on here so that you can go down and then you can go down to here. If you go into your standby, you can play back clips right within the camera. It's going to give you your temperature and it's going to give you your voltage and stuff. That's basically it on this camera. It's very, very simple. You can see here there's vents here, and you might, again, be able to hear the noise of these fans running, but there's some venting and stuff on here. One of the things I found challenging with this camera was me rigging it up for the way I wanted to use it. So it has a 1/4 or 1/8. I always get confused with those different sizing there. They're all these imperial sizing. I'm Canadian. I like metric, but those different thread sizes, the standard kind of thread sizes you have for tripods on a lot of cameras. There's one on the top, there's one on the bottom, but that's all you have. I was trying to use some of my different cages that I had and trying to see if I could rig something else that fit, but I couldn't get anything really to fit. So I have this top handle on here, but it's just held on by one screw, and the same in the bottom. And I had problems with this kind of coming loose very easily because you don't have enough anchor points. If I was to purchase one of these, the first thing I would do is figure out how I can get a cage on this and how I can mount things on this easier and how I can protect like some of the ports like the HDMI port. Another thing to know about this camera is that there's no way to monitor this camera just out of the box. It's just basically, again, just a brain in a thing with a sensor. So, you have to be able to put on a lens and you have to be able to put on something with an HDMI monitor. So it takes HDMI out and your monitor. So the only way to see your menu settings and all those things is to have an external monitor or an EVF that has HDMI inputs. There's no other way you can see this thing. There's nothing built on the back of this camera, anything like that. The other thing is there is built-in power or battery into this. I don't really know how big it is. I never really used it, or sometimes I just used it for a little bit, but what I was using most of the time, or pretty much all the time, was I had this other V-mount plate on here. I put some rails on it, and then I put a V-mount on, and then I was able to use that to power the camera, then that to power a monitor as well. You also get a DC power plug, so you can use that to power it when you're plugged into a studio, or if you're locked off in a studio and have access to power, or when you're transferring your footage as well, because you need to turn this camera on and transfer off of the USB-C off here to your computer or to a hard drive to get the footage off of this camera and to be able to use it. And one of the other things to know about this camera is that the footage it shoots to it is its own codec, its own compressed or not compressed or whatever it is settings. It's its own files. It records to these files. They're kind of, you can't read them any other way besides downloading the Freefly WAVE software. Okay, so the Freefly WAVE software is a free thing. You can just download it from the Freefly website. I can link to it in the description below. You can then be viewing the clips that you've taken besides playing it back within camera. And you also need this to process the files. This is where things start to get really frustrating with this camera. The WAVE software is not great. I had problems with it crashing all the time. And you think about you're shooting a lot of slow-mo, so it takes a lot of time to play back. It takes a lot of rendering time, a lot of processing time. And I basically spent like a day just kind of going back and forth between two computers trying to process all this footage and get it out in a ProRes 444, codec, something I could work with in our editing software. That was definitely a challenging thing with it. The batch system, you can batch out a bunch of clips on there. It seemed to actually work better than just doing one clip at a time. When you did batching of stuff, it would run and be some reason I had less problems with the app crashing. But that's definitely something to note when you're working with this camera, that the software, there's going to be a lot of work on the post end. There's going to be a lot of work on the processing end to get this thing working. Another thing to know about this camera is that it is a E-mount, which really excited me. It was like, it's a native E-mount camera. So I shoot on mostly Sony, and I have a bunch of E-mount cameras. But one of the things to really note with this is that it's an E-mount camera, but there's no electronic information and connection with any of your lenses. So if you're using Sony lenses, and they're actually Sony ones, and they're focused by wire, the focus isn't going to work on them at all. I've tried out with a few lenses. You cannot control any of your aperture. So those lenses, this actual Sony lenses, are kind of useless on this camera. There's no information that can get from the lens to the camera. I was able to use some of my Sigma lenses because they're not focused by wire, but when I wanted to adjust my aperture, I actually had to go into another camera like my A7S III, adjust the aperture, and then take it off, and then put it onto this camera again. Not ideal. The best way to use this camera is with proper cine glass. So manual lenses, whether you have old lenses that you've modified, if you have Canon FD lenses, things like that, where you can adjust your aperture manually and you can adjust your focus manually. You need a lens like that. So what I ended up using, and I have here, are some of the stuff from Sigma, and thanks for Sigma Canada for letting me use these lenses. It's the 18 to 35 cine lens, and I also had the 50 to 100 cine lenses. These are awesome cinema glass. They're big, they're heavy, but they're beautiful. They have amazing images, and they're fully manual. So, I can adjust my f-stop. I can adjust my focus, everything like that manually with these lenses. And that's what you need for this camera for it to really work, or you're going to be really struggling, which I had for a couple of days when I was first shooting with it. And I realized, wow, I can't use majority of my lenses with this camera, or easily use a majority of my lenses. And actually, again, the Sony lenses, when they're focused by wire, I could not get them to work at all. I couldn't get any focus to work because it needs that electronic information going back to the camera. So the focus would not work one bit. So borrowed these lenses from Sigma Canada. They worked awesome. Got some amazing shots with this. This camera is super, super fun. I mean, I love slow motion. I kind of love the two extremes. I love slow motion and I love time lapse. Slow motion I've loved for before I could properly shoot slow motion. Back in the old days, shooting on my FX 100, or sorry, my FX 1000, I would do these slow motion effects in post and they look crappy, and you were shooting an SD, a mini DV, and I just loved seeing stuff in slow motion. And then my next camera after that, that was kind of like a real step up and a camera that could shoot proper slow motion, and it was a big deal at the time, the Panasonic HVX 200. Panasonic HVX 200. This camera could do 60 frames per second, real slow-mo in camera at 720p HD. That was a huge deal. This is back in like 2006, 2007. That was a huge deal. No other camera really like this kind of camera was doing that. And I shot tons of stuff. I probably shot way too much stuff at 60 frames per second. Jumping into a little bit later in my career, I had the Sony FS700. That was a huge deal of a camera in the sense of its frame rates. I could do 120 frame per second bursts, 240 frames per second bursts at HD. Awesome. Then up to the FS7, which you could do 120 frames per second, or sorry, 180 frames per second in HD, 60 frames per second in 4K. Then to the FX9 and the FX6 and the A7S3, all those able to do, sorry, not the FX9, but the other two other cameras, you could do 120 frames per second in 4K. So a camera for me that can do 422 frames per second in 4K is awesome. It's just like you can capture some really awesome images. And I did have a lot of fun with this when I was playing with it. Shot some fun things, just kind of had some fun with it, had some snowballs thrown in the face, poured some beers, drank some beers, did some stuff that way. Bit of a camera test when we were prepping stuff before the shoot, but also just having some fun with it. And it really is fun shooting some stuff like this at 422 frames per second. Now, I should say as well that this camera actually does have the ability to shoot higher frame rates. You just need to go down in your resolution. And you can shoot at 2K and you can shoot at 1,000 frames per second plus. But I had read this before even renting the camera. I only did a couple tests with it. And what I've read and what I experienced was really true. It looks really bad. Like the 2K compared to the 4K looks terrible. Like really not usable. Maybe usable for some Instagram reel kind of things, but I know why you using a $10,000 camera for Instagram reels. It just, I didn't even bother with the 2K at all after looking at some of the stuff of it. It's great to be able to do 1,000 frames per second, but it didn't work. So another thing to note with this camera, with the manual lenses, with your manual aperture and all that stuff, is that there also is no NDs built into this camera. Again, it's very simple. It's like a DSLR, a very simple DSLR. There's nothing built into this, so you're going to need to be able to use something to control your light. Again, this camera needs a lot of light. I mean, a lot of light. When we set up stuff in the studio, I used every light I had, and I probably wanted more. So this camera needs a ton of light to use. So outside, though, on a ski hill with a lot of sunlight and light reflecting off the snow, I did need to use ND. So I was using the Tilta Mirage matte box, or I was using Polar Pro ND filters, depending on the lens. I really needed that to help balance the light a little bit, but I also ended up just kind of stopping down on these lenses a lot because I needed to make sure what I was shooting was in focus, and I didn't want to shoot stuff so shallow. So shooting at something like an f8 wasn't a big deal for me because, you know, we really needed to get these shots. We only had so many times we could do it, and it was tricky with this camera, but it was a lot of fun as well. So overall, camera is super fun. It worked. It did what it was meant to do. I would love for it to have a higher dynamic range and some more options that way, but hey, it probably wouldn't be the price that it is for this camera if it did that. So very happy with it. You know, thanks so much to the guys at Ontario Camera, the rental. Thanks for Sigma for letting me use these lenses. Thanks to the people at the resort where I was filming. We had a lot of fun with this. I would probably rent this again. I don't think this is something I would buy unless I had tons of need for it. You can watch another video I have done before about whether you're renting or leasing or buying and what you should be doing, you know, and if you're renting a camera a couple times a month, then you're likely better to buy it. I don't think this is going to be the case for me with this camera, but I could see myself renting this again. I would love to have it. Like, I would love this to have it with me on some shoots and be like, this would be super cool to shoot at 422 frames per second. But for the cost, for 10 grand, 12 grand Canadian, it's not really worth it to have with me just in case I wanted to shoot something. And a lot of the time, 120 frames per second is slow enough. Really, there's been so many cases where we've shot a lot of stuff and different things. There's a big running documentary that I worked on, and we were shooting a bunch of stuff at 120 frames per second or faster, and we found that you never really played it back that slow. It just took way too long, and things worked really well at 60. So for me, for probably 90%, 99% of the stuff I'm shooting, being able to shoot at a frame rate of 120 frames per second in 4K is slow enough. Being able to shoot 240 at HD is probably slow enough. And my editor that knows that I love to shoot Slowmo will not like it if I have more options for slow-mo, because I'll just shoot more and more slow-mo and he'll have to scrub through all those footage and then just retime it back to being faster again. So I apologize, Davey, for all the slow-mo that I shoot, especially 120, which we never use it at 120, but it's good to have. So overall thoughts on this camera, it's fun, it's great. I'm not going to buy one. But you guys, if you want to go out there and rent it, this should give you some insight on how to use it, tools you want to use. If you're looking at buying one, these can be amazing. I have a friend that shot a music video with this camera and had just shot some beautiful, awesome images of that and very unique stuff with that. So there's some great uses for this camera. Thanks so much, guys, for watching this video. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. Please think of subscribing to the channel. Please ring that bell to get notified next time I upload another video, and we'll see you guys on the next one.